Jesus Christ, a member of the Jewish people, participated annually in the Feast of Passover, a significant religious event commemorating the liberation of the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. This celebration, deeply rooted in Jewish history and faith, symbolized the passage from slavery to freedom. Today, around the same time, Christians around the world celebrate Easter, the feast commemorating the resurrection of Jesus. Just as Passover carried the message of physical deliverance, Easter proclaims spiritual liberation, from death to life, from sin to salvation. Yet the question remains, why does this feast not have a fixed date? Why is Easter movable, unlike Christmas, which is always celebrated on December 25th? To answer this question, we must go back 2,000 years and examine what the Jewish Passover truly was and what significance it held for the first Christians. Passover was one of the most important and solemn feasts in the Jewish liturgical year. It was celebrated annually in the month of Nisan, with Jerusalem as the central place of observance. The faithful made pilgrimages to the temple, where they offered the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. Then, within their families, they would partake in a festive meal accompanied by carefully prescribed rituals. The meal included roasted lamb, unleavened bread known as matzah, and bitter herbs, and the entire feast held profound symbolic and religious significance. During the meal, the story of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt was either read or recounted. It served as a reminder of how God had commanded each Jewish family to offer a lamb in sacrifice and mark the doorposts of their homes with its blood. On the night when the final plague swept through Egypt, the homes of the Jews were spared. The angel of death passed over, causing them no harm. This is the origin of the Hebrew name for the feast, Pesach, which means to pass over or to spare. The next day, the Israelites set out from Egypt, beginning their long journey to freedom. The celebration of Passover was meant to be an everlasting remembrance of that night when the nation was delivered by God. The celebration of Passover began on the 14th day of the month of Nisan in the Jewish calendar. That was when the sacrificial lamb was prepared. The actual Passover meal, which marked the feast itself, took place after nightfall on the 15th of Nisan. It's important to remember that the Hebrew calendar differs significantly from the Gregorian calendar used today in Western countries, which is based on the sun. The Jewish people measure time according to a lunar calendar in which each month begins when the moon is not visible. About 14 days later comes the full moon, the phase opposite the new moon. The months are shorter than ours, lasting around 29 to 30 days. This creates many challenges, as over time, the calendar's seasons begin to drift out of sync with the actual solar year. For this reason, the Hebrew calendar must be periodically adjusted according to the position of the sun. And every few years, a leap year is added with a 13th month. In practice, then, their system is lunisolar because it is based on both the moon and the sun. Another important difference lies in how a day was understood. For the ancient Jews, a new day did not begin at midnight, as it does for us, but at dusk, that is, at sunset. Therefore, even though the Passover meal took place in the evening, it was already part of a new, festive day, the 15th of Nisan. Unlike the modern understanding of a day, which lasts from midnight to midnight, in Jewish tradition, a day extended from sunset to sunset. This shaped the way feasts were celebrated and how the Sabbath was observed, which also began on Friday evening and ended after sunset on Saturday. Such a perception of time was closely tied to the cycles of nature and the rhythm of daily life in the ancient Near East. To illustrate this for a modern audience, imagine that you've traveled back in time to the ancient world, and it's Monday. You see Jews gathering at the temple to offer the lamb that they will later eat during the Passover meal. This means they are currently observing the 14th of Nisan. Later, you witness the end of the rites, and people return home to prepare food. The sun begins to set. It is still Monday for you, but as the sun goes down and the Jews sit down to the Passover meal, they are now in a new day. Tuesday, the 15th of Nisan. For them, the day runs from sunset to sunset. Christ died during the Jewish feast of Passover, and he himself became the true sacrificial lamb, whose blood brings salvation. The first Christians, many of whom were Jews, naturally continued the tradition of celebrating Passover, but they gave it a new, Christ-centered meaning. It was no longer only a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt, but above all, a commemoration of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Initially, Easter was celebrated precisely on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, together with the Jewish Passover, regardless of which day of the week it fell on. As Christianity began to spread beyond the Jewish community, first to Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome, differences in liturgical customs began to emerge. More and more communities, especially in the West, began to celebrate Easter not on the 14th of Nisan, which could fall on any day of the week, but always on a Sunday near the time of Passover. Sunday, according to tradition, was the day of Jesus' resurrection. As a result, tensions grew between communities that celebrated the most important feast of Christianity on different dates. The climax of the dispute came around the year 190, when Pope Victor I attempted to impose the practice of celebrating Easter on a Sunday throughout the entire church. Christian communities in Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey, refused to comply with the Pope's directive, and he threatened them with excommunication. Although a full schism ultimately did not occur, this tension revealed just how diverse the early Christian liturgical practices were, and how deeply they remained connected to the Jewish calendar. The dispute over the date of Easter was ultimately resolved at the First Council of Nicaea, convened by Emperor Constantine the Great in 325 AD. The council decreed that Easter was always to be celebrated on a Sunday, specifically the first Sunday after the first full moon following the vernal equinox, which occurs after March 21st. This preserved both the symbolism associated with the full moon, since Passover always fell during a full moon, and the liturgical significance of Sunday as the day of the resurrection. This method of calculation was independent of the Jewish calendar, emphasizing Christianity's distinct identity and ensuring uniformity of celebration throughout the empire. The council's decision laid the foundation for the method of determining the date of Easter that remains in use today in both the Catholic and Protestant churches. Although the Council of Nicaea set the rules for determining the date of Easter, it did not assign the feast to a fixed calendar date, as was later done with Christmas. There were several reasons for this. Most importantly, Easter had always been deeply rooted in the Jewish calendar, particularly in relation to Passover, a feast celebrated during the full moon and the spring equinox. Christians did not wish to sever ties with this tradition entirely, but neither did they want to be dependent on it. Therefore, they retained the symbolic rhythm, spring, then the first full moon, and Sunday, the day of the resurrection. Additionally, assigning Easter to a specific day of the week, Sunday, made it a movable feast by definition. If a fixed calendar date had been chosen, such as April 7th, it could fall on a Wednesday, Friday, Monday, or any other day of the week. However, from the beginning, Christians emphasized that Jesus' resurrection occurred on a Sunday, and that this day held the greatest liturgical importance. As a result, Easter always falls on a different date each year, but always on a Sunday, and always near the full moon, following the spring equinox. Thank you for your attention. I invite you to support me in creating this channel on Patreon. You can also click subscribe, give a thumbs up, or leave a comment. All of these actions help the channel grow. Warm greetings.